By far, the best thing you can do to increase your odds of success when planning to build a new B2B SaaS business is to sell whatever you're planning on building before you build it. This is something that I am constantly preaching that people need to be doing, and still, most do not take advantage of it. But if you want to avoid common pitfalls in this business, like building a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, this is the best way to do it. Okay, I want to make this easier for everyone to understand so that you know exactly why this strategy can be so powerful and so effective. So think about it in terms of if you were to build a home. One of the challenges with building B2B SaaS businesses is I think it's often misunderstood just how expensive in both time and money it's going to be in order to build whatever it is that you want to build. But think of it instead if it were a home. If you were planning to build a home and you weren't sure what type of home you wanted to build, maybe it's a single family house, maybe it's going to be a condo, right? Whatever. You randomly choose one. You choose single family home. 6 months into the process, where they maybe have poured the foundation, they've built the first level on the home, they're stick framing everything out, you decide, oh no, actually at this point, we don't want a single family home, we want to build a condo. And you go to the builder or the architect and you tell them that. What do you think they're going to say? They're going to say, well, what do you want me to do with this? Because everything that we've done thus far is basically useless in terms of what you want now. You should have told us what you wanted in the beginning, and you should have been certain about that, because what we've done thus far is going to be a total loss. Now, this is almost exactly the way that this happens in the B2B SaaS world, time and time again, over and over again. I see it always. That's why I'm so adamant about folks planning to sell before they build, so that they know they won't wind up in this situation. Now, the equivalent in the B2B SaaS world is you've built the foundation of a product, or you've built features and functionality that all of a sudden you know you can't sell. When you finally get around to bringing that product to market and trying to sell it, when you release it to crickets, or you can't beg people to use your product, let alone pay for your product, now you realize you've got a huge problem, right? Your stomach sinks, you panic, and all of a sudden this plan that you've been building towards for months and may have spent tens of thousands, or God forbid even more than that, money in getting you to this point, now you realize all of it may have been for naught. It may be a total and complete loss. Now, that's not always the case, but I've seen many people in that situation. So the best thing, again, that you can do to interrupt this process is to sell it before you build it, so that you don't wind up in this situation. Okay, now that you know why we should be doing this, I want to walk you through how I'd recommend you actually do it, and how I typically do it for any of my early stage B2B SaaS products, so that you know how you can invest in this process before ultimately building, get the kind of substance and the performance data that you need to know whether or not building that product actually makes sense. Now, the way to do that, first and foremost, why I love this as a strategy is it forces you to determine a couple of key variables that are really important to get a better understanding in even beginning the process of selling altogether. And that is determining what variables like your ICP and your UVP actually are. And your ICP, just to reiterate, is your ideal customer profile, and your UVP is your unique value proposition. The ICP is essentially who you're building for. What is the persona that has the problem that your product ultimately solves? You need to be crystal clear about that, as well as how you're solving that problem. That's the UVP, your unique value proposition. And in order to test both of these, a great way to be able to do that, and something I leverage all the time, is I build a landing page in the form of a website that communicates my UVP to my ICP. Then I drive traffic towards it in order to determine how effectively I'm able to create leads or prospects into people that are expressing interest in wanting to use my software, and ideally pay for it as well. This is how you can set up one of these tests to really get a better idea in how effectively are you able to sell that product concept before you build it. So your website will speak to your ICP, that persona that has the problem. It'll explain to them, here's the problem, I know you have this, I understand this is the impact of the problem, right? You want to pull on some of those emotional components because those are very relevant for them. They're probably looking for a solution to it, or ideally they are. That's what we're testing. And then you should also speak to how you're going to solve that problem with your product. This should all go into the landing page. So as they're making their way down the page, they'll see each of these sections. They'll get a better understanding in how your product is going to help them with what matters most for them. And then ideally, you should also have on there pricing information. Here's how the product is going to solve those problems. Here is what that is going to cost. And then in order to determine how many of those visitors are able to convert into potential leads or people that may be interested in paying for or buying your product, create a lead capture mechanism on there. I usually use a bunch of different calls to actions on the site. Usually they fall into only one category though. It's usually like sign up or buy now or whatever, something like that, but each of the buttons are branded similarly. That goes to a lead capture form using something like Typeform or Google Forms or whatever your preferred option is there. And then in there, it's capturing their information, at least their email, ideally their name as well too, what they're interested in paying. So if you've created a couple of different tiers for options for your product, you can enable them to say which one of those they're interested in as well too. That gives you an indication in what they're willing to pay if you've provided a number of options on your site. And then any other open-ended information you may want to know as well. Now keep in mind you want to balance this, as in you don't want to necessarily ask 100 questions. That may discourage people from filling out the lead capture form altogether, but you don't want to just capture only email. You want to capture a little bit more substance here as well too, because again, we're in testing mode, right? This is the early stage version of determining whether or not we're going to be able to sell your product concept. So this is the strategy that I like most effectively. And then once you have all this set up, you could drive traffic to it with something like ads. That will enable you to get more visitors on your site if you're targeting the right people and in the right location. But ultimately, what we're planning to do here is measure conversions to see how effectively you could communicate that UVP to your ICP to determine how many leads you're able to capture. Okay, after you've set up your landing page experiment, ultimately what you need to be able to do on the early stage here is measure the financial performance. So not just the performance in terms of how many leads you're capturing, but ultimately financially and at a unit economic level, how well you are performing, because that will give you a great indication on a very early stage here in this process of how effectively you're going to be able to turn this B2B SaaS product into a profitable business, which is the objective here, right? We're probably not looking at only having a hobby here or providing a product for folks that is going to be us taking on losses. We're trying to generate a return, if not a significant return. So your B2B SaaS business, if it's healthy, should be highly profitable. This is the earliest version of being able to determine whether or not you're going to be able to do that. And again, this is all before you build. So how do we do it, right? Well, based on how you're driving that traffic, if you're using something that's tangible and quantifiable like ads, which is typically what I do, based on the landing page experiment I just went through, you'll know how much you're investing to drive how much traffic, and then how much of that traffic is ultimately sending you those leads. So as you're capturing those leads, over time, you're going to be able to measure how much that's cost you in order to perform at that level. Now, what we're trying to avoid is a situation for every $2 you invest, you get $1 back, right? Because we don't want to be taking losses here. Now, there are other more complicating factors that are going to be relevant in the long term, like your LTV, in terms of how long your customers are paying for you for access to your product. If you're talking about a subscription-based product, which more than likely we are in this case, that's going to be relevant here in terms of what you're spending, but I'm not encouraging you to go that far because you're not going to have that data yet. People aren't using your product at this point. Your product doesn't even exist. So we won't know how long they'll use it and overall how long they'll stay and how much they'll pay and all that kind of stuff. But on the early stage version of this, if you're only running this experiment for weeks or even a few months, you'll have enough data to be able to measure what the performance has been so far, and theoretically or hypothetically. Because obviously we don't have your product, so people aren't probably actually spending any money yet. They're just saying what they would spend based on, again, your UVP and your ICP. So having said that, based on what you're spending relative to your budget to drive the traffic and how many leads you're capturing, plus what those leads are saying that they will pay to gain access to your product, we can ultimately measure what the performance there looks like. So for every $1 that you're spending, if you're bringing in at least $1, then you are breaking even on your cost, which is great. And that might be just based on that first month of what they're ultimately saying that they will pay, because some will turn over, but some will remain, right? So over time, you're going to have that LTV number, and then your return will be much greater than that. But ultimately, I want to talk more about the range in terms of what we want to see, or what I typically restrict my B2B SaaS projects to before I consider whether or not to move forward into the build stage. So we're going to talk about that next. When you're measuring performance, this is what I'm looking for in terms of the range to determine whether or not we actually want to move forward with the build. So if you've set up that experiment, you've got your landing page, it's communicating your UVP to your ICP, and you have the numbers in terms of how much you've spent to drive that traffic, and how many leads that you've received thus far, plus what those leads are saying that they're willing to spend, you can ultimately determine what does the range or what does the calculation say in terms of what you've spent to drive the traffic versus what you could theoretically have brought in if you had access to your product and people were able to pay right away. That'll determine ultimately where you wind up here in terms of what I'm referring to as the range. Now, for my projects, what I'm looking for at minimum or the bottom is to cover my costs. As in, if I'm spending $20 to capture a lead, I want to bring in $20 from that lead as well also. So whatever it's costing me to ultimately get that lead that's saying that they'll spend $20, I don't want that to cost me more than $20. That's my minimum, which is still pretty high in terms of level of performance here, but I always want to err on the side of being conservative to make sure that I've got pretty strong product market fit even before I even have my product. So that's my one extreme. That's on the lower end. I want to cover my costs just from what they say they would spend in the first month. And now on the other end, what I typically will see on the higher end is a 2-to-1 return, something like that. So for every $20 I spend to capture a lead, I want to be able to bring in $40, for example. So that's kind of where my range winds up. As in terms of return on investment, I want, either break even all the way to and through, I want a 2-to-1 return. So for every dollar I put in, I want $2 back. Again, theoretically or hypothetically, because this is simply an experiment that we're running to determine early stage financials to make a decision whether or not we should move forward. And I'm going to share with you some examples in terms of projects that I've run recently from both extremes. One performed very well, one did not when I ran this experiment. So you can imagine which one we ultimately decided to move forward with, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Now, something to keep in mind here is when you're ultimately measuring this return, you need to realize that not everyone that's filling out your lead capture form is going to convert into a paying customer. That happens. Just as we're going to ultimately want to know what our LTV will be in the long run to really know what our actual return on investment will be. As in, you might be able to spend more to get those leads because they aren't just going to spend potentially all of them for the first month. As in, they won't all churn. So there are a number of different variables here, which when we run this experiment yet again and measure your financials, those are going to be relevant as well, but that's later stage stuff, right? Keep in mind, we're still on the earlier side here, and this is determining if and when you should build. So this is early stage information, which should influence you to make smarter decisions in terms of if and when you should build to prevent yourself from building in the wrong direction. So let's talk a little bit more about those case studies so you can see what some of these examples look like in the wild. All right, it's case study time. So now I'm going to go into some detail about two different B2B SaaS products I was considering building, one that ultimately moved forward and one that didn't because of how well they performed related to the strategy that I'm recommending you deploy here to determine your early stage financial capability and your ability to be able to sell these products before you build them. Now, for sake of argument, the two products I was considering, I'm going to be referring to as podcasting and meetings because one was to help podcasters and the other was to help folks book meetings. Now, when I ran these experiments, the podcasting example for my ad spend versus ultimately what it brought in, I was able to generate a 2-to-1 return. As in the first month, the amount of leads that I captured multiplied by what they ultimately said they would spend was double what I had spent to generate all of that traffic in the period of a month. As such, the podcasting example moved forward, and I built and launched that product. Share those details with you as well also. The meetings example, had actually the exact opposite situation. I end up spending 2-to-1 in terms of what came in versus what it spent to ultimately acquire that traffic. I spent twice as much on the traffic or the ads to bring in half as many leads in terms of what those leads ultimately amounted to. So the number of leads I brought in multiplied by what they said they would spend, as in what would have been my monthly revenue for that first month, was half of what I spent on the ads in order to generate that, again, theoretical revenue. So these are two examples and both two extremes, which should serve to help you better understand ultimately what these examples may look like in the wild if you leverage this strategy, and then ultimately a decision you may or may not make to move forward with one or the other. So the podcasting tool came back and performed relatively well. As such, that one moved forward. I built that MVP, I launched that product, and that one now has active paying customers and is growing. Meetings, on the other hand, was not performing well financially. So if I couldn't sell it now, what was going to change if I built it? Nothing, right? Like, because people were deciding whether or not they wanted to buy it just based on what was on my landing page, just like they do everything else. So meetings wasn't ready. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't ever move forward with whatever that concept was, right? But that does mean that I probably need to go back to the drawing board in order to figure out some of those variables, some of the product market fit, maybe what the product ultimately does, the problem the product solves, right? However I've aligned all of those variables up, it's just simply not working yet. At least it's not working to the extent that it needs to be to justify investment in order to build it and then ultimately launch, try to grow that product into a profitable business. It's just not likely to do that because early signs are that it's already essentially kind of losing money. So what you want to do then is you want to evaluate how well this experiment is performed, measure that performance against these benchmarks that I've given you, and then from there you can decide if and when you want to move forward with any of the projects that you're deciding ultimately on building. So if they perform well, then you may have an opportunity to build that product. If they don't, then I want you to think about going back to the drawing board, adjusting some of these variables, and then trying to get this experiment, rerun it essentially, and then see if you can get the range of performance back into the threshold that I provided so that you can cross that barrier before you ultimately move forward. This will save you a fortune in terms of time and money, because if you ultimately built the original version that you were thinking of for that product, then you more than likely were not going to be able to sell it. The best thing about this strategy is that you know that now, and you don't need to spend 3, 6 months, a year, whatever, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars building this product that ultimately you can't sell. So this will save you a fortune in terms of time and money. And trust me, from someone who has made this mistake in a major way multiple times, but definitely one major one, this is by far one of the most effective ways that you could determine whether or not you should move forward with whatever idea it is you want to chase. Hey folks, thanks for watching my content. I hope you got value out of it. If you did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you can be notified when more content like this becomes available. My question for you, which I'd love for you to answer in the comments below, is what is your favorite or most effective strategy determining whether or not you can sell your B2B SaaS business before you build it?